Hi, everyone. Welcome. Can you hear okay? My name is Kristen Fox. I'm a managing director at Tyton Partners, and I'm so happy to be here with all of you today to talk about what instructors need from digital learning providers. So for context, today, just to share a little bit of course, what we've all been through, what an incredible period of time it's been. Over the course of the spring of 2020, 90% of instructors converted their courses to emergency remote learning. And over the course of 2020 and 21, we saw over 71% of instructors incorporate new digital tools into their classrooms. So really just unprecedented in terms of the scale, scope, impact on instructors, institutions, and students. And we saw this transition happening on top of what we already knew was a pretty unequitable outcome in terms of teaching and learning in higher education. So we already know that students who are poverty affected or are from BPOC populations are less likely to attend higher education and less likely to complete. So 66% of white students are complete within 6 years, and it's 45% of African American students, right? And one of the issues there is gateway courses. So gateway courses, which are those courses that are introductory level, often are gateways into upper level courses and progression into majors, and oftentimes high-paying STEM majors also have outcomes that are not as good, depending on the student population. A recent Gardner Institute study in 2019 showed that Black students were as much as 21% more likely to DFW or drop, fail, or withdraw from one of those courses relative to white students. And a similar but less stark distinction for Pell-eligible students or for low-income students. So what we saw, though, is during the pandemic is digital learning, and pre-pandemic, digital learning, when implemented well in those courses, can really change the outcomes and improve the ability of educators to incorporate active learning and effective practices that are more equitable. And so a couple of the things that I'd like to set the table for our panel here today with are some observations of things that we learned about the role that digital learning can play and the important role that the vendor community plays in helping educators and institutions in implementing high-quality digital learning. So we saw that digital learning is core infrastructure for teaching and learning, and that was really elevated during the course of the pandemic. And we see that reflected. We at Tyton have surveyed and done focus groups with tens of thousands of faculty and academic leaders, and we've seen over 3/4 say they're investing in digital transformation and plan to increase the use of digital learning tools in introductory level courses. A second thing that we've learned is that digital learning is really effective and can be effective in transforming pedagogy in those courses. And specifically, we saw most instructors walked away with a better impression of online learning and digital learning than pre-pandemic because of what they experimented with and saw in terms of the ability to use digital learning tools to modularize and break learning into smaller chunks, to get learning data back that enables them to adjust their practice, provide feedback more proactively, and other mechanisms like that. And we'll talk about those more today in our session. And lastly, and the third thing we learned is that partnership between the vendor community and institutions and faculty is core and important. As institutions rush to pivot during this period of time, that support from vendors in terms of professional learning, in terms of implementing high quality pedagogy was really critical, and that's something that's going to need to continue. So I'm really pleased to jump into our discussion with our panelists here today, where we're going to talk about those silver linings as well as some of those challenges in implementation, selecting and identifying high quality tools. We know that it's not the product that matters or does the work, but it's how that product or those tools are implemented in the classroom and to support high quality teaching. So how can we work together to do that? And so I'd love to introduce my panelists that I've got here, and we'll dig into the conversation. They're all doing work at their institutions that is really focused on centering equity in teaching and learning and doing that at scale. So to my left, I've got Jill Buban, who's the was prior, when she joined our panel, was the VP of Online at Fairfield, but is now the General Manager at EdAssist, which is a Bright Horizons company. Fairfield serves over 4,000 traditional undergraduate students and is developing out their online capacity. So Jill will speak from both of those perspectives, and we'll hear from her. Then Erin Lynch, who's the Associate Provost of Research, Scholarship, and Innovation at Winston-Salem State University. Winston-Salem is an HBCU that serves 4,500 undergraduate students, primarily traditional age students, and that are studying on campus. Notably, that's relevant for today's conversation, she was a key contributor to the development of a tool called Course Gateway, which you can locate at coursegateway.org, which was a collaborative effort funded by the Gates Foundation to develop a searchable tool that can help instructors and institutional leaders identify high quality, affordable, and equitable digital tools that can be used in the classroom. And then we've got Elgrie Hurd. Elgrie is an instructor at Dallas College. He teaches introductory psychology and sociology courses. Dallas College is the community college network in Dallas and serves over 12,000 undergraduates. Over 50% of them are Latinx, a quarter are Black, and a majority are studying part-time. Pre-pandemic, 60% were not enrolled in any sort of distance learning, and obviously that pivoted significantly over the course of the pandemic. And last but certainly not least, Connie Johnson, who's the provost at Colorado Technical University, which is a private for-profit university that delivers courses online primarily to adult learners, serving over 23,000 undergraduate students. And notably for our discussion here today, Connie has led some really great work implementing adaptive learning at scale in undergraduate level courses to increase course outcomes for learners. So as you can see, a really diverse set of institutions and perspectives and serving different types of learners around this topic. So let's start it off by talking about the students that you serve at each of your institutions. And Elgrie, we'll start with you, and I'd love to hear how you focused on meeting students where they are during the pandemic and the ways that you plan to focus on incorporating digital learning in your work moving forward.
I think one of the challenges that many people faced during the pandemic at the beginning of it was that we assumed a lot about what students and educators were comfortable with doing as it relates to digital platforms and learning resources that are digital. And there was a lot of assumptions with that. And with those assumptions came problems of creating unintentional gaps between the learning process and students. So one of the things I learned the hard way were that most of my students had smartphones, how to utilize them, how to utilize the learning software that we use, our learning management system. There were certain things that I thought were obvious that were not. Simple things like uploading a document, how to find it on your computer, and having to transition from my thoughts to changing to having literal screenshots of step-by-step on how it looks on my page. And we're talking about students as young as 14 and students as old as 70. Because I serve dual credit students as well. And so those challenges of students just not knowing because they just never had to, or someone would walk them through it in the classroom, but now they're on their own. I think one of the things that I like to move forward with going forward is making sure I know more about my students. I think that's what this has taught me explicitly. So one of the things that I do explicitly now is I am surveying my students at the beginning of the term, finding out if they have an actual computer or whether they're working from their phone, and asking that up front and knowing that to be able to offer additional resources. Asking questions about, are they working or not? To figure out how I can create additional resources to be able to communicate with them. I know the connection point with students who are digital has been a really important factor on students who are successful in my classes. And so trying to find opportunities, giving students my cell phone and giving them parameters on which they can reach me, and utilizing other digital means of communication, because that's what it takes if we really want students to grow and prosper in this digital world, because they're not going to necessarily have simply face-to-face. That may not be a reality for every student, even as the pandemic wanes down.
Great. And Elgrie, you talked a lot about, in some of our calls, how you're using digital learning tools to really foster connection and community amongst your students, and to balance the how you make sure you use them to forge that personal connection and not to prevent that personal connection from taking place. Anything else that you'd add around that?
I think it's just important to remind students that you're people, that you're a human being, and that you exist outside of the classroom setting. I think it's important to let students know it's okay that they need more time, but they need to be proactive and communicate. And I think it's important for administrations to have support systems that support students and educators in a meaningful way, not just a check the box way, because what I've seen during this pandemic is a lot of checking the boxes, and that's not really helpful in making long-lasting change in this new learning environment that we're navigating.
Great. So Connie, how about your perspective as a provost overseeing many faculty doing this work, and how are you thinking about the student experience and ways that you'll be focused moving forward?
I think that, first of all, it's great to be here and see people in person, not on video, but, +1 to what Elgrie talked about. But I want to talk about something a little different, and this is really for vendors. We are a primarily online institution. Our students are adults. They're working adults, first-gen students, students in the military, and quite an array of students. And what COVID did was really test the pipes on the adaptability of vendors. And what we found, and I'm just going to say ditto, is that students moved to devices. They moved to their phones. They moved to their tablets. A lot of students didn't have towers, they didn't have iPad or laptops, and so if vendors told us, yes, it's mobile responsive, what we found is that it wasn't mobile responsive often. And things like on a tablet, the tab went away. You can't find where to forward. It screens down. When you go out of an application and come back in, you can't find it again. Videos don't play. And what I can tell you is that it's a large issue for us. Because we deal in volume, and I say that because we do have a master class model. We can run 20 sections of a class every 5 minutes. Just to give you an idea of size and scope, we were working with a vendor who was $1 million a year in sales with us in a tool that we stopped using because it didn't adapt to our students. And so what we found is that, and I say this with respect, vendors didn't flex and weren't keeping up with students and weren't keeping up with where students were and how they were accessing content. And they didn't have towers and they didn't have laptops and they didn't have the library to go to for a while, or they couldn't go to their relatives. There are 7 people on internet in the house and the bandwidth went away. And so what I want to say here is that mobile adaptability is so important, and that's what we learned, because students failed courses because of technology. And for us, student outcomes, we're constantly trying to move student outcomes forward, and when the technology becomes a barrier because it doesn't adapt to where the student is, then we will walk away from the technology. And so that is what we found in COVID.
Thanks, Connie. How about from your perspective, Erin?
Yeah, I was going to say that actually feeds directly into a lot of what we're looking at from the equity lens, right? So often we're thinking about equity as accessibility for universal design, ADA compliance, but not being able to pull up a tab because it's not a feature, right? When you switch from the desktop to the phone to the iPad is also an equity issue. And so a lot of things that we found with our students, we went from 800 of our courses went online in a semester. Even now, we still have 50% of our courses for this fall are still online, which is really high in North Carolina, but we have a very special population. And so being very cognizant about how we were designing from the user experience to the content was extremely important for us, and we brought in external people to help with that process. But when vendors don't think from an equity design and equity-centered approach from the get, you can see it at the tail end when it comes time for students to engage with the products. And so when we went through our courseware development process with Gates and APLU, that was something that we were very, very cognizant of from the very beginning. So every single tool that we evaluated we started with the equity lens. And it was very, very clear which design companies and which vendors also started from the equity lens when we were evaluating these products. And that goes directly to Elgrie's experience with his students. When it's not there from the beginning, students feel it in the tail end. And so I just want to piggyback with ditto to everything Connie said with how important that is.
And help us, let's unpack a little bit, right? What does it mean to design through an equity lens, right? And what are the asks, right, from all of you, both for students and faculty, right, in terms of making sure that materials are accessible, et cetera. Because Connie, for example, you've really focused on the short-term impact and migration to cell phones, but that's something that we know that it's going to continue, and that many learners, that is their most reliable, internet access, et cetera. And so, that's something that we should expect to move forward as a for instance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So if you look at equity design principles, right, we know there's 6 of them. But the one that I push the most is having those voices at the table from the beginning during the design phase, right? And so what does that look like? So that means, and sometimes this might be hard in certain tech industries, right? Having those underrepresented groups, right, engaged from start to finish with a product. Because you can tell, my background is special education, you can tell when a person comes in and they add on special ed accommodations after the fact. Versus when they start with universal design for learning and it's embedded naturally. The same thing goes with the equity content and components when we're designing our courseware. You can tell from the beginning when they decide to just randomly put a colored face, right, on a picture. Content doesn't match at all, right? Or when they randomly want to talk about, there was some courseware, I'm trying to remember, where they wanted to integrate more social sciences as real life examples, real world examples. But then when you do that from a very hegemonic perspective, you can tell that it wasn't a natural fit, right, with the examples. And it wasn't a natural fit because you're not bringing it from someone's lens who truly experienced that, right, or who knows of those lived experiences. And so for us, being that our institution is a historically black college, 85% of our faculty are of color, right? And so the majority of our faculty, when they teach, when they're designing their content, they're already coming from a perspective of the lived experiences of a number of our students. We do have a traditional age population. We're growing our graduate school. Let's go. Super excited about that. And so a lot of our instructors, also went to HBCUs. They know the HBCU experience. They live in the same communities that our children are coming from. And so they're able to do and use the equity design principles because they are from the beginning designing with our students in mind. And so that's a big piece that I think vendors really need to.
And you're challenging both in content and platform, right?
Absolutely.
Both matter.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Yeah.
So Jill, tell us about the student experience at Fairfield and some of the lessons learned and carry forward there.
Yeah, sure, Kristen. So I think it's interesting in listening to my peers, and I'm reminded of some adult learning, pedagogical, andragogical approaches that it's dangerous when we make assumptions about our students. So whether it's the adult learner and how they want to access, or a community college student or traditional age, that they know how to use a phone, they know how to do attachments, and they can access anything anywhere, or they'll just figure it out. So I think all of these assumptions are dangerous for us, and really kind of unpacking who our learner is and meeting them where we are is true no matter what type of institution we're at. And that speaks a little bit to my experience at Fairfield. 4,000 traditional students on campus. I was brought in actually to build the graduate online, but coming in right at the start of the pandemic, our focus was this switch to remote learning for these 4,000 18 to 22-year-olds. And I couched that in the assumptions because there were so many around. They know how to use technology. They're smart, Jill. They're at Fairfield. It doesn't matter if they have to access their classes from 5 different places. So that was we had 5 what we were calling LMSs when I came to campus. I guess it was April 1st. And we did narrow that down to 1. We got it down to 1, and I was able to say we need 1 access point. I don't care how smart they are. No one wants to go to 5 places for their classes. But it just reminded me so much of some of some of the principles I think we forget, whether we're designing programs or courses or any learning experience, that it's really dangerous to make assumptions about where our learners are and what they're doing. And the same was true for graduate. We brought 22 programs online within the year, but it was that same, it gets dangerous with graduate adult learners or undergraduate adult learners and thinking, oh, they're smart, they know what they're doing, they can access technology, or they don't care if the course is robust enough or the content's great, or accessibility too. That was a whole learning experience because we had an accessibility office on campus where students went in and they talked about their accommodations. So it was reskilling, upskilling for the whole campus population around what accommodations were in the online environment. So I was reminded, kind of after being in national level positions in online and adult learning, that a lot of our institutions are still at that 1.0 of building online. And our community has so much we can offer to kind of help guide them from the beginning in areas like accessibility or mobile devices or using one LMS.
Well, yeah, and there's a lot there, right? And one of the things too that, so I want to go back to that in a little bit around selection and how procurement and selection processes, right? The decentralized and centralized nature of that, right? And some of that's behind the 5 LMSs, right? But before we go there, what I first want to talk about a little bit too is the faculty experience, right? We've talked a lot about the student experience, and I want to talk about the faculty experience because, as we all know, implementation matters, right? And just like classroom teaching, full, not technology enabled, hybrid or online, there's great classroom teaching and not great classroom teaching. There's great use of digital pedagogies and not great use of. And we know that implementation and support are a key component to that. So I hear from institutions, right, we need more support from our institutions, we need more support from our partners. I also hear from vendors, we need to make sure we are supporting our faculty and institutional users, but we also need to make sure we do it in a way that scales and is sustainable. So I'd love to start with you, Connie, for some reflections around that in terms of, how can institutions and the vendor community better partner around some of these really important issues for better impacts and product retention and use.
Sure, and you heard it this morning if you listened to Michael Crow's keynote, the importance of faculty, and we believe that. And we have 1,000 faculty, most of them adjunct, and we have at least 600-700 using different kinds of technology beyond the LMS. And how did we get there? It's exactly what you were talking about, Kristen, as we supported them. So we develop trainings, we work with vendors to develop trainings. If the faculty can't figure it out, then it won't work. And so we spend a lot of time ensuring that our faculty are supported through, we've set up call lines for them to call in if they'd rather have one-on-one. We have FAQs, we have videos, and it's so much easier if a vendor has these tools for us. But I can tell you, not all do. And so that is something probably to think about as well, is how in touch with you or with the faculty, because I would posit that if the faculty are not successful in using the technology, the students will not be successful, and I'll take it one step further. If a faculty doesn't support the technology in the classroom, then the student will probably not have as positive an experience as they would if the faculty loved the technology in the classroom. And so that's really central to our model. We believe that faculty can make or break digital tools in the classroom.
How about Elgrie? I'd love to hear from you on this one, right? on the front lines of both fielding IT requests from students and implementing, both continuing to use and implementing new tools.
I think I've had the privilege of working in public schools, teaching K-12, and there's this, when you teach in public schools, you're told your first year is just get through. Your second year, you'll kind of figure out a lot better. And third year, you probably have it down cold. I think that's true often with asking instructors to adapt technology, is oftentimes vendors want you to adapt it in one semester. And if we're being honest, that's not enough time. That's not enough time to navigate through it and navigate through your classes. It takes maybe 2 or 3 semesters. Yep. And my experience is that a lot of vendors aren't necessarily that patient. I've asked for more time, and vendors says, well, no, you need to do it in the semester. I said, well, I guess I can adapt to your technology. And I think it could be great for the student, but I don't, like I said, I don't want to give my students something that I'm not comfortable with and have them struggle and me not be a resource, me be a detriment to that technology. I think the other thing is we forget that how many people who teach in higher ed are adjuncts. You know, I'm an adjunct at other places besides where I am full-time. And there isn't support consistently at each institution on how to adapt this technology. So vendors have to be very intentional, not just working with the instructor, but working with the institutions. I think if you want faculty to have buy-in, it shouldn't be they're out on an island. Because ironically, that's how a lot of students feel, out on an island. And so we have to change that mentality of allowing faculty just to figure it out, because they may do the same thing for the students, which in turn doesn't help the student, doesn't help the faculty, and doesn't allow the vendor to benefit and show the benefits of their technology that they have available for students and faculty.
Anything else, any other advice in terms of implementation, Erin?
Yeah, so you mentioned, and this is where the thought went, about the number of adjuncts. The other piece of that is I also want people to understand most university faculty are not pedagogists, right? They're content experts, right? They are chemists, they are economists, right? They are humanities instructors, all right? I couldn't think of the field. And so that element of now teaching in a post-secondary and higher education, we're not taught how to do that with adult learners or diverse populations because we are discipline experts. And so when it comes to course design, the digital tools that are presented for us as faculty need to take that in mind, that we are not instructional designers. And so, well, I am, but most of us are not, because we didn't go through a college education, right, to learn about pedagogy. And so you have that compounded with, right, when the technology is not enthusiastically adopted, right, as Connie indicated. And then on top of that, they have to design away from what they've been used to doing for 5, 10, 15 years in the classroom, just getting up and speaking their content, right? And so all of those things compound and make it a very inequitable situation for students when faculty don't use the tools to engage with the students. From HBCU perspective, and this is by no means our HBCU is a monolith, okay? There are 105 HBCUs in this country. 85 to 90% of them are teaching institutions. There are only 11 research-oriented HBCUs in this country. And so most of our HBCUs are teaching schools. What does that mean? Very high impact with students. And so when we switched to this online environment, right, the student experience completely changed at a lot of our HBCUs. You know, the faculty who hang out in the hallways, you know, who have open office hours, who are kicking in on the yard with the students, you know, to have those conversations where they would build those connections and relationships, it just didn't happen anymore. And so when the tools that we started to implement didn't allow for that type of process, that type of transition also, it became extremely problematic for our students. And just across the country, we saw enrollment went down, but our HBCUs and a lot of our MSIs were hit really, really hard because that personal piece was not there because our digital tools weren't embedded with that in mind also, so.
Yeah, and I think one place really for us to collectively think about what do we learn from that, right, is there are places where we actually we heard faculty say I had better engagement, right? I had better engagement from the quiet students who were then able to engage in learning using different formats and different modalities. And I had places where it was more challenging, right, to see folks, you know, reaction or feedback to a concept where their eyes were glazing over. So how do we think about taking those best of, right? How do we take those because I think what we are talking about is a hybrid learning environment, right, where you've got instructors who are using digital tools to enable the best components of active learning, and how do we make sure that we're equipping instructors and institutions to do that, I think would be my push. And I'm curious, Jill, if you've got any reflections on that.
Yeah, I think even taking it, I guess, back a step before we're talking about adopting the tools and the technologies, and that process before that, I think, is so important in the selection. And so here we are at this conference, and there's so many shiny new things, and we're excited, and we're hearing about all these tools and these analytics and technologies. Or if you go to, as we get back in the conference circuit, it's any of those. We're all jazzed by the presentations and the exhibit hall. And it's how do we evaluate those tools to ensure they're the ones that we could, implement, I think, more broadly on a campus or with our peers if we're faculty, so that faculty have that peer network, I think, of learning how to use the tool. And I say, how do we evaluate? Because it takes a village, I think, on a campus. So oftentimes that evaluation can come up from a faculty member or whomever that was at a conference or had outreach from the 500 vendor emails. Or it could come from IT or the Teaching and Learning Center. And what I've found is this kind of triangulation between academic affairs, wherever the online unit is placed, and and information technology is just so crucial. And there's oftentimes friction between some of those departments. But in my past at the Unison Consortium, and then again at Fairfield, I was just reminded so much of how the information technology team is so helpful in evaluating for student data and security, and that's so helpful. They're not trying to dictate what technology to use, but they can do those checkpoints oftentimes for accessibility as well. So I think that support system in evaluating before adopting or implementing is so important and helps the university, the institution, to drive the conversation as opposed to the vendor partner. And with all of that knowledge at the university, it really can be a partnership as opposed to one having leverage, I think, over the other. And that's really crucial. And I see some heads nodding, so I'm happy.
Yeah, and I hear repeatedly from instructors, right, we were trained to evaluate content, right, and to think about what content, but not in how to evaluate technology. And that becomes a really different decision, but it's related to pedagogy and how teaching happens. So any other thoughts around ways we think the procurement or evaluation process will or should evolve that are important to share? And Connie, I'll let you start on this one from your provost role.
Sure. I think that Jill talked about data, and so I'm going to go down that path a bit. Very important to have the ability not only to evaluate what's happening in an individual classroom, but at a macro level for an administrator. And so what I have found with a number of products is that the classroom dashboard's great. All that information is in the classroom. But if I want to aggregate data of sections and look at different faculty, for example, teaching or other that aggregate data, that is farther and fewer between than I would have thought with vendors, and that would impact a procurement decision. I think that Elgrie talked about the ability to pilot. We often want to pilot. We don't want to roll it out in all sections until we've had some time to pilot to ensure all the bugs were worked out. So if it's a vendor who's not going to work with us on that, then we won't move forward in that case too. If there's onerous contracting and you're going to keep my data and I can't see it, because it's your data, you perceive it as your data, even though it's our students, then that's not going to work too. So those are some of the nuanced. And I will say in the last 5 years, much of this has improved because I think vendors are hearing it more. But those are some of a few little sticking points that might impact the procurement process.
I see you nodding quite a bit, Erin. Anything else that you would want to add to that?
Yeah, so the ownership of data, right? The ownership of data, that is an equity piece, right? I serve on a lot of review panels for National Science Foundation, Department of Ed, and we constantly have that conversation when we're reviewing research proposals as to the researchers going into the minority communities, and then what are we doing with that data, right? Those data. Are we allowing the community members and the stakeholders to then have access to their data? And so when vendors come in, and it's one of my biggest pet peeves, when vendors come in and don't allow us to have our data, like it's an extra service fee or it's something extra in a contract, right? That is extremely inequitable, because you wouldn't have the data if it wasn't for our students, right? You wouldn't have the contract if it wasn't for our students. And so being able to share that information also speaks to the equity components, either being embedded in the vendor mission or not, right? So yes, that was just a big pet peeve of mine.
Yeah, those are really big pet peeves. I think it's also important that we keep talking about students, and I think some vendors get it, but I think collectively we're not there yet. Just because you did a pilot program and it worked for enough for you to market it to an instructor or to an institution, you need to verify it again and see how reliable that is, and check with those students. It's great to check in with faculty, see how they're going, but as a faculty member, I see things differently than as a student. So as an instructor, but also as a parent, my children see things differently. You know, I have nieces and nephews who are college students. They see things that I don't see. So if we're truly about closing that digital divide, if we're truly about closing equity, those kind of things, then we need to be intentional about asking students continuously, not just once we get a platform or some type of learning process up and running. It's got to be consistent, because if not, it's so easy for the voices who are often not heard to continue to be voiceless in the conversation where they matter.
Go ahead.
I would just make one quick comment too. I'm hearing all of this, you know, the conversations around procurement, definitely data. And I hope that, I feel like a lot of the work that maybe we did with national organizations was put on hold during the pandemic. So I keep thinking of our friends at Tyton or IMS Global or the Unison Consortium, EDUCAUSE. I mean, they have working groups that are trying to have impactful practices in all of these areas, and I feel like our attention was kind of put on hold to those, and you know, I just urge us to all get back involved so we can move the needle and have impact on behalf of our learners.
There's some really good work and thinking in the area of learning analytics happening, et cetera, across those groups around policy practice.
And APLU, because we have our analytics guru here.
So in our last couple of minutes, I'd like to give everyone the opportunity to share, you know, the area that you feel is important, right, for continued collaboration and focus between the vendor community and institutions, et cetera, in service of ensuring that there is a, you know, vibrant option set of high quality digital tools that are equitable and support good pedagogy in the classroom. So I'll turn to my left. I'll let you start us off, and we'll go down the line. Jill.
Okay, mine's probably from the tech side, but I'm so focused on the data even in my current job now, and so it's how do we have effective communication around data sharing agreements, and then as techie as it sounds, the APIs. I'm just seeing that hold up so much, so moving that work forward from the tech perspective really impacts our learners, our worker learners, so. Yeah.
Mine's definitely from the human perspective, so the equity component. I don't think I can harp on that enough. And so leveraging the universities in partnership by bringing in interns from our universities, right? I read a proposal not too long ago where the company openly stated because they lack diversity from their design to implementation, they needed this funding to help increase the diversity in their company to make better, more equitable products. Well, if you partner with the same institutions that you're wanting to work with in creating broadening participation programs where you bring in computer science students of color, right? You bring in females, you bring in other underrepresented groups, individuals with disabilities from the beginning through partnership to design, then I think that would help address the need, the shortages that we're seeing in educational technology design to the implementation. So that equity piece is the biggest takeaway that I want companies to know.
Yeah, that's a good systemic solution. How about Elgrie?
I think kind of adding on to what's being said, the necessity for learning software to not be in addition to, but to be engaged with the student learning process. Too often, vendors have different systems, and students go away from engaging with their peers. They go off by themselves. But we know the research shows about working in teams and building community is how they thrive. So the ask for vendors is to be more intentional instead of pushing students away with the learning software, to have them do it on their own, to create opportunities for them to engage, which will in turn help the students, but also get most likely faculty institutions to be more willing to buy in and support the efforts of that vendor.
And mine would be, I listened to an on-demand session this morning from Google and at this conference, and they were talking about how institutions still don't know what they're doing, faculty don't know what they're doing. Not true. There are many of us that know what we're doing, and we've been doing this a long time. And so treating us like, we're all one size fits all really isn't going to work, because there are a number of institutions who are way into this, and so that would be my plea. Don't treat us like one size fits all and we don't know anything.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. If you do have questions, we'll be outside the door as the next session will begin shortly. But thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.